Hey, welcome back. My name is Sean, and today we're going to be talking about the Spellmonger series. Specifically, why I think it's a great series that has absolutely been slept on, and we'll be doing a review of Book 1, Spellmonger. So I got into the series a few years ago, and honestly at the time I was looking for something similar to the Dresden Files. I wanted a witty wizard that would talk some shit. I wanted a hard magical system that would progress, and I wanted that wizard to be thrown completely out of his depth and have to just somehow come over out of the top through unlikely odds and hijinks. And the Spellmonger delivered. What I wasn't expecting, however, was for one of the more interesting takes I've seen in an epic fantasy universe. Aside from all the normal epic fantasy things like the magic system, the world building, the plot progression, Spellmonger really is a weird mix of things. It feels like it's taken like good parts from military fantasy, definitely some elements of grimdark, and it mixes it all together in a very human way. I see this as an issue with some other fantasy series where you can have all these epic moments, it's cool progression, but when you really analyze it or think about it or try to describe it to other people, it just feels more of the namesake, like a fantasy. It feels somewhat removed from reality, where if you were really set up in such a way for these events to happen, then would it actually progress that way? And I thought the Spellmonger was one of the more realistic takes on this. Statecraft and political power play a huge part in it, which I was actually pretty refreshed to see. So having some actually novel combinations in this book series, as I progressed through it and read novel after novel, I found that the world expanded in a huge crazy way, and the characters were actually realistic and likable and messy. And so whenever things went completely to shit, it felt very organic and very human. I didn't feel like things had to happen because plot had to happen. It felt like, oh, well, we had to make a really shitty deal to make this one political bargain, and oh my god, it came back to bite me in the ass. And everything was done in such a believable way that, as it progressed and progressed, I found myself, I just did 10 books in a row and still wanted more. I feel like, and these are not small books, if you get on the audiobook, you're looking at like 18 to like 35 hour like long books I've seen with some of these. So after what was essentially like a month or two of just listening over and over to John Lee, the narrator's sweet voice, I was still excited when I saw like, oh, book 11's on pre-release and it's going to come out like in 6 months. And so that's when I realized that, holy shit, this series is pretty special and I am a huge fan of it. So going through the first book, it's very easy to go through it, say like, oh, it's okay / good, it was enjoyable, and then to put the series down and not actually experience the totality of the series. And I'll get into a review of book 1 later, and there are some negatives to it that I think do turn some people off to it. With the sheer scope of what the series becomes, it is really wild, and some of the choices that Terry Mancour made to get all the info that you're going to need for later on in the series, he delivered it in such a way that I could see it turning some people off. I mean, for me, this read more like the anti-Malazan, which was a relief, but I could see other people just not enjoying that. But the scope of this, it's wild. You have magic, you have elves, gods, you have Cthulhian horrors, technology, you have all of this crazy moral human delivers growing and growing and growing and placed squarely on the shoulders of just one wizard who just woke up hungover one day to a goblin invasion. And the characters in here, are all flawed, which I really enjoyed. No one's perfect. Menelin himself is a constant source of his own problems on a personal sense, and it's very humorous and fun and enjoyable to get through. But where I think this really shines, other than the fact that the world expansion is so crazy, is you do get more realistic takes, I think, in the fantasy universe. So often you'll read a fantasy series where you have the chosen one who comes out, draws a sword from the stone, kills the bad guy and then gets crowned king. And it's like, oh, cool. The system's just going to go on because that's how government systems work, right? Just one person comes in and it's smooth sailing for the good guys. But instead, the political intrigue and statecraft that is in the series are a very real thing. And especially early on, because I would still count this as a progression fantasy. The main characters will gain power as they go through it. A lot of it's going to be political power, and you don't just go from 0 to 100 within that. The slow progression and having to deal with the conflict that arises when you have an established order of people and you're having chaos from war, and then just the instability of the new rising order of these mages come through It's really well done and enjoyable to get through. And with the character flaws and everything, no one's one-dimensional, which is also one of my huge problems with progression fantasy. Generally, when you have such characters growing and more power and, doing more cool things, they eventually stagnate as people where they don't have to learn any character lessons. All of this weight of the war and the political intrigue and then just the sheer burden of trying to save everything rests squarely on one person's shoulders, and you see that weight start to mess with them. Another thing I really liked and why you should get into it is that after 14 books, I thought I would stop getting surprised with some of the reveals and the plot directions that the book series has taken, but we are presented with an onion of mystery where we're trying to figure out not only what is happening with the war effort and all the things that are driving the main plot, but how did everyone get there in the first place? And there are a bunch of mysteries that are presented in this way. You're done in such a way with these mystery boxes where you keep peeling back onion layer after onion layer, and eventually you think like, oh, well, I'll get to the bottom or I'll get bored with this. But for me, I just kept peeling back more and more, and we're now like 14 books in. More things keep coming out and just more surprises keep happening. So the fact that Terry Mancour has been able to keep it fresh this long has been pretty crazy. I'd also like to acknowledge that, with that realism, I do like his take on the sexual aspects of the world. Generally, when you are dealing with books that will have this amount of sex into it, it's treated more like erotica. This book never read that way, but it just felt more like a realistic depiction of it. I do think that sometimes with fantasy series that you wind up just cutting out that portion of it, and if that's a major human drive and a big part of what is to be human. So I always feel like some fantasy books get neglected because of that, and that is, some people hate it, some people choose to authorly leave it out. I'm not going to read a Brandon Sanderson book and expect him to start writing in that sort of way, and I'll still enjoy Sanderson. But, this was a more refreshing take on it. Now, all this giant scope and growth and things that I really enjoy about the series grows over time as the series progresses. As of recording this video, I think book 14 just came out. The series is very long, and it doesn't start out as something that I found particularly spectacular. I thought Spellmonger book 1 was fairly enjoyable, but while it had a lot of potential and a lot of things, until I saw it actually executed on, I thought, it was an okay book. Good, not great. Started with a lot of a fantasy series I like. It got me hooked enough to continue to see what was down the path, but it does have some issues. There were a few things here that I didn't like when I through my first read through, that going back again and rereading it changed my mind a bit on it, but for someone initially getting to the series without the foreknowledge of what happens with the series, I do find them to be a bit off-putting. Mainly, it's how they handle a lot of their world building. It's almost like the anti-Malazan, where rather than, showing instead of telling, you just get these giant first-person exposition dumps. Now, I don't find them necessarily terrible, but you'd be in the middle of the plot, and you would then spend, 5-10 minutes having the main character talk directly at you, trying to explain or give you context of what's happening. And this is fine sometimes, but the sheer breadth of some of these exposition dumps, it seems like, you almost forget where you were in the plot as this was happening. Ranging from the political implications of running a modest bakery in a medieval setting, to the nuanced history lessons of how the Empire actually found itself in its current state, and how the theoretical magic works and certain things. And it sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't. Having read the series, I found it interesting just to see the sheer amount of foreshadowing and little details that were dropped in there that will be used later on in the series. But, some of the devices, like we had a flashback sequence where we're following past Menelin as well, just to make sure that when certain characters arrived or certain concepts were introduced, that we would be completely caught up at all times. It sometimes bordered on too much, and if you don't like these giant exposition dumps, or if what drives you to series maybe isn't the world building side of it, but rather the action, you do get abruptly pulled out a few times, which I think probably could have been handled better. Now, the writing in this, I didn't have any complaints about it. It didn't really stand out to me as great. It was first person, which kind of changes my perspective on it. I really loved the flow of the narrator and how he delivered on it, so I found it still to be pretty enjoyable, but I wasn't just blown away. Some of the things that I didn't like, though, were the confrontation setups, where you're building up to have this big confrontation with a bad guy or someone that you've been, steadily making worse and worse and worse as this book progresses. The more you can dial in on a character and build up that tension and make it where the satisfactions can be super enjoyable, I feel like some of those scenes got just overcooked a little too long. Where rather than just sitting there going like, oh, just you wait, the payoff is going to be so good, I can't wait for main character to do major plot thing. And instead I started getting annoyed about what was actually happening, and the urge to just kind of skip through just to get to the payoff started to really build. And on one hand, the fact that the author is able to evoke that type of emotion out of me means that his writing is good enough to like evoke that type of emotion out of me. But, when I'm reading a book series and I'm starting to get annoyed by just the sheer length of the time it's taken to build up, then, that probably could have been shortened in a few places. And this is a fairly long book, so between the exposition and some of these like unnecessarily long build-ups, there was a lot of fat that probably could have been trimmed. And this absolutely improves down the line. But some of the characters are very obviously written for you specifically to hate them. And oh, do you hate them. And lastly, this isn't an issue for me, but I do know this does off-put it, and I mentioned it briefly. But if you don't like mixing sex into your fantasy, then but if you don't like that mixture of the two things, then, this probably isn't the book for you. Sex is depicted here pretty natural, pretty healthy, and I don't think there's anything too crazy with it. You do get later on where that does some critical plot points, and it is used as a plot device in some, potentially unnerving ways for you, but while I don't mind it, I do know some people specifically don't like that. And I've had friends specifically complain about certain scenes where in this book itself, sex magic is a big plot device that gets used. And that is so not what they're used to that by the time they get to it, they're kind of left weirded out by it. Keep that in mind. It does get better as the series progresses, and I think it's handled in a better way. But it doesn't ever completely go away. Now, all those negatives aside, I still absolutely enjoyed the book. And rereading this first book after not having read it in a while and going through the entire series, I really enjoyed this read-through this time. All the extra world building and every little detail that went in there, I was just absolutely surprised by the sheer level of forethought that went into this series, because the size of it gets pretty crazy. So seeing some of these things hinted at in book one and some of the illusions that are happening early on was just really crazy. I'd love to know how much of this was actually plotted out before it actually went through there, because it doesn't feel like it was just flying by the seat of their pants. And if it was that, then that's equally impressive, because it just made everything feel like it was really tied together. I like the mixing of the genres here. At some parts it really shines as a military fantasy. You have all the character like romances and the different sort of relationships between characters. I think's really done. Having the characters be flawed and messy and really relatable, I thought was extremely well done. And there's multiple really unique takes in this. This book not so much, but as we progress through the series, we get more into the political statecraft side of things, which I think is a pretty fresh breath of air for epic fantasy. You have certain books that do have that as a major part of it, but generally not coupled with the progression fantasy side of things. Generally, you're going to see something much more grimdark or much more along the sides of a military fantasy. But in this hand, I thought it really worked well. This is one of the few books I've read with a master-apprentice arc that actually doesn't take place in the eyes of the apprentice, which I thought was refreshing. Normally, you'd use the device of, hey, I'm the apprentice, let me have the master world dump everything into my small little brain to learn it. But instead, you're in the mind of Minolin, having his perspective of trying to teach young apprentice and actually knowing how to navigate in the world and everything, and especially coming to the small village after fighting in a war. I thought all excellently done. So that all being said, while the Spellmonger I think is a fine start, it's just okay in my mind. The series just will grow and grow and grow, and if you find the characters likable, if you like the magic system, if you like the slowly expanding world, or at least if the exposition and sex didn't scare you off, then you definitely should check out the rest of the series, because it becomes something truly special. And as I was going through the last few books I like to write, I was having my mind blown by some of the concepts on there where it just spun me off into these creative fervors. So Terry Mancour is definitely good at evoking emotion and ideas, and it's just a really fun series to get through, so I highly recommend it. I will be continuing to review these books mainly because I just want to reread the series, and this is the perfect counterpoint to Malazan, where rather than having to wait for sparse little details and please trying to give me some more of that plot exposition, I'm just handed everything I'd want and more, and it's set in such an enjoyable universe that I don't mind, just having someone tell me more about something I already find pretty interesting. If you want to check this out, or you start picking up the series, now pacing the videos as I make them, because I go through different book series, so I'm not getting too burnt out on any one book series. You should check out this guy, David Green. He is actually one of the few people I've seen on YouTube who's actually done any type of content related around the Spellmonger. I watched his The Spellmonger is Underrated video, and pretty funny dude. Go check him out. But thank you guys for stopping by and watching. I will eventually review every book in the series, and I will likely be rotating it along with my current set of books. So the beginning after the end, Malazan, this, and eventually I'm going to get back into Joe Abercrombie, but for the next few months, you should see a lot more of these related videos. So, if you like it, and if you want to see more, let me know. I'm going to be doing it anyway, but it's always nice to know I have at least some buy-in with it. I'll be putting links below to David Green's channel and also to the book series online, Terry Mancour's website. Really enjoyable series, and one of the things I liked most about Terry Mancour was just the sheer pace of which he could release it. All in all, I had a lot of fun reading this book. I love the series. I love what Terry Mancour is doing, and the fact that he's doing this all through indie publishing too is super inspirational, and I love to see it when indie writers are successful. But thanks for watching.